is to introduce our keynote speaker of this second session, Professor Robert Noland, or generally known as Bob Noland, and very well known in this field. And Bob is a distinguished professor at Rutgers University, and there he also directs the Voorhees Transportation Center, and also is the director of the PhD program in planning and public policy. Perhaps, Bob, you could actually perhaps say a little more about yourself, and then you can start.
Okay, I think you pretty much covered it. I don't really have much else to say about myself. And do I just click share screen here to get my screen up there?
Well, I probably need to unshare, so
okay.
Hold on a sec, just to make sure that I can unshare the screen, which I have done. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you for putting this workshop together. It looks really interesting, and 2 weeks ago it was quite interesting also. A lot of interest in these topics, obviously. So first of all, I want to acknowledge my two collaborators on this. Evan Jacobucci, who's a PhD student, just finishing up. He's going to be on the job market. I was putting a plug for him if you're looking for someone. Wenwen Zhang, who's a new assistant professor in our school, who works on travel behavior and modeling. So we were interested, well, let me give you a little background. This specific presentation is really looking at, activity during the pandemic, how that has changed, how walking activity has changed, and also how cities have responded to this, to the demand for more walking space and more outdoor space for people. So our survey, which I'll talk about in a second, is much broader, covers a lot of issues, but this is what we focus on just for this presentation. And our key research questions here are whether people have increased their active travel as a result of these street changes, these street closures. Do people like them? Do they like having these sort of street changes in their communities, or dislike them, and why? And is there any indication that people would like to see these changes made permanent? Okay, so just to give you some nice visual images. So we're talking about things like slow streets, which is basically cities that have closed off streets to traffic, except local traffic, just to give people more space to spread out while they're walking outside. Walking was one of the only activities that people were engaging in, especially going back to last March and April when New Jersey was really hit hard, and even last May until things started loosening up a bit. In the summertime, there was a push for outdoor dining, and that closed off streets. On the left there, you see New Brunswick. That's where Rutgers is located. And many of us have argued for years that this street should be closed off to traffic. And it happened. And this other one's in Princeton, New Jersey, where they kind of closed off half the street, put up these concrete barriers for outdoor dining. The Princeton case is interesting because the town a few months ago passed an ordinance to make this permanent. And so what they did is they closed off half the street, turned a two-way street into one-way traffic. Part of the rationale here was here on the left to allow curbside pickup from restaurants. The state, of course, the state of New Jersey, the New Jersey DOT said, doesn't like any of this stuff. They see streets as a way to just allow movement of vehicles. And so they're going to now require a traffic study for 1 year to see what the impact of this is. And then they will decide whether they approve of this being a permanent closure. So that's kind of the political context we're talking about, the current regulations that make this difficult for a community to do. One other here, this is in Highland Park, New Jersey. Well, this is what it looks like when there's about a foot of snow or so that came back in early February. Okay, so what we did is we had a survey, New Jersey-based survey, representative survey using a Qualtrics online panel because it's relatively cheap to do and relatively fast to do, although we did find that it took nearly 3 months to collect our full sample. We started November 30th and we just closed out about 2 weeks ago, February 25th. Got a sample of 1,450. Survey was long, which is I think why it took so long to get a full response. One thing we did, we were in discussions with a team at Arizona State and University of Illinois at Chicago, their COVID future project, to have some similarity in some of our key questions. Although the ones I'm talking about today, they did not ask about these sort of street closures. But some of the questions where you're looking at before and after sort of changes. For those of you that do not know where New Jersey is, this is New Jersey, this is New York City up here. So it's a major commuter community into New Jersey, into New York City. Newark, New Jersey is a large city, Jersey City. Philadelphia is down here, so the southern part of the state's influenced by that. You probably know Atlantic City, Princeton, New Brunswick's where Rutgers is, and Trenton's the state capital. Just to give you some geographic context, this is the northeast corridor, runs along here. If you've taken the train or you've driven the New Jersey Turnpike, that's pretty much where it goes. Okay, so our survey covered a broad scope of these COVID behavioral impacts. So impacts on working and studying, shopping and dining, transport, attitudes, and then some demographics. And we have some geography questions in there to try to figure out where people live. But I'm just talking now about the street closures and outdoor dining and active transportation and perceptions. And there's a lot we can do with this data. We have just scratched the surface. It's only been 2 weeks here. So this is pretty much a preliminary sort of result. So let me talk about our outdoor dining questions. So we had questions just to get an idea of how many people were aware of arrangements made for outdoor dining, and something like 85% of our sample said that their local area had made arrangements. And then to look more specifically at what had been done, dining was set up on sidewalks, so that's about 60%. Parking spots were converted to dining, and then some streets are closed to traffic. So these two, the use of sidewalks and parking spots were the largest component that people reported. And parking is always a controversial issue, that you're taking away parking spots. So that's quite interesting to see that happen. Then we asked kind of like people's perceptions of what they thought of these sort of outdoor dining arrangements. And for the most part, if we look at the two left-hand columns here, most people agree that it's made the area more interesting and lively. About a third don't really have an opinion, it's neutral. Bringing more people to the town center, again, kind of the same. If I combine these two, we got 38% here and 36%, so 75% or so. And then outdoor arrangements have made it safer to walk in the town center. Not too much, the neutral category, not too much difference there. And we've got kind of the agree and disagree being similar there. Then of course, there's always the question, what people care about, that it's going to cause congestion if you do this sort of stuff. And we find that, first of all, over a third disagree with that assessment based on their experience. About a third, have no opinion, I guess, or they didn't see any change, okay? But we still have this, 31% that thought it caused congestion. And that's always going to be the excuse that people use to try to block these sort of policies. The other question is, has it made it more difficult to walk? Obviously, if you have more activity on the sidewalks, more people in your community, in your town center, it may be more difficult to walk. And so, again, it's pretty balanced here. A few more, 38% agree that it made it more difficult to walk. Okay, so we then asked questions about whether things should stay this way after the pandemic. And again, we're getting about 40% agreement that they want to see that stay the same. Only about 30% disagree. Parking spots should remain dedicated to outdoor dining. I'm surprised actually 47% see that as a good use of parking spots. They think that should stay the same. Outdoor dining should continue to be set up on sidewalks. So again, about 47%, okay? So a little bit more support for using parking spaces and the sidewalk than for closing off streets. Although there's still a large plurality there of agreement there. Okay, let me talk about some of the active travel questions. Was really to try to figure out whether people feel it's safer for walking and bicycling. And about only about 44%. I don't remember what the blue and orange are. I think blue is yes and orange is neutral. That didn't show up very well. Yeah, I mean, if we look at that, it's as these two as kind of generally support that it's made it either, it has not made it less safe, and it's made it safer is what some people think. Okay, so one thing, I don't know if everyone noticed this, but I certainly noticed back in April and May how many more people were walking outside of their home. And even in areas where there were no sidewalks, if I'm north of where I live, if I'm looking around there, I was surprised to see how many people were walking on much more rural streets and such. We find about 40% now walk more often in their local neighborhood, and they walk longer distances than they did before the pandemic. So more active travel. They walk more frequently for pleasure than before, and they walk more frequently. We asked whether they walk more frequently to accomplish a task, and about a third did. Still a large plurality disagreed with that statement. And that may be very dependent on where they live, whether there's anything that they can walk to. And just anecdotally, at least for myself, I actually walk less to accomplish a task, because if I'm walking to the grocery store, I'm probably getting a lot more stuff than I used to, so I don't want to carry it home. So it's going to be very idiosyncratic, I think, on that sort of perspective. We asked then about whether people are more familiar with their neighborhood. I'm more familiar with my neighborhood now than before the pandemic, because you're walking around more. Maybe you get, you know, your community better. And again, about 39% agreed. More comfortable walking a mile. A lot of people think a mile, or 1.6 kilometers, for those of you unfamiliar with English measure, is an enormous amount of distance to walk. We actually did a study about that a few years ago. But about a third, again, agree that they're more comfortable walking a mile now than before the pandemic. I don't know whether this disagree means that they were always more comfortable walking a mile, but it is interesting to see this kind of shift towards agreeing. Since the pandemic, I started to walk to shops or services that I previously only drove to. Small amount, 30% say that they agree with that statement. So we haven't done a lot of cross tabulations and such to kind of look at this and look at some of the demographic effects. We haven't done that at all yet, with the demographic differences. But we did say, look at the question, I walk more for pleasure than before the pandemic, and link that to whether accommodations made in my area for safer walking and cycling. And so we see here that 68% agree with this statement if there is safer accommodation. Okay, so that's and you look at this side, if there was no safer accommodation, it's only 19% here, and 36% disagree. And then also, we looked at some streets should remain closed for outdoor dining. again, the same sort of pattern that if there are safer accommodations for safer walking and cycling, about 55% agree with that statement. And then same sort of pattern here. So what are our key takeaways so far? And I want to stress this is all very preliminary. All things equal, well, or at least looking at I'm not sure it's all things equal, but people say they walk more during the survey period than they did before the pandemic started. Now, keep in mind, we actually did this. Our original thinking of this when we put in our proposal, which was in April or so, was that we would do this kind of after the peak, after a summer peak. We thought there'd be a lull in the fall. But we didn't get the survey out till the end of November. So we actually did it at the peak period of the pandemic. Okay, but it's also wintertime when people may be less likely to engage in outside activities. In any case, they still say they walk more during that period than before the pandemic started. There seems to be an association between street changes to support active travel and self-reported walking. And there's an association between street changes to support active travel and support for continued street closures. This last note, actually, I didn't present this, but respondents seem willing to change behavior post-COVID. And let me just throw that up here. I thought this would be kind of difficult to show, but these are some of the things that people want to see continue or say they want to see continue after COVID-19. Working from home more, commuting less, driving less, traveling less, but what are the largest? Shopping online more, taking more walks. That's kind of one of our key ones here. More cooking at home, So all these things are there in our survey for further analysis still. What we're going to continue to look at is working at home, our questions on that. We also have a big focus on transit. New Jersey has a large transit commuting into New York City and into Philadelphia, and try to assess how that behavior has changed or whether it will recover. Someone actually told me yesterday that our local buses are back up to like 90% of pre-pandemic usage, which surprised me. However, commuting into New York City still remains down, probably at about 40 or 50% pre-pandemic. Will online grocery shopping continue? We're going to look at disadvantaged communities, how they may have been affected, and then any geographic patterns to behavior change. Areas that are more transit accessible or have a higher population density and how that may have affected behavior. So I think that's it. I hope I'm within my time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bob, actually leading by example, actually coming in within the time. And we have time for a couple of questions. Maybe I could ask one to see whether any other colleagues have immediate questions. And out of the list of the changes, what is your hunch that which one is going to stick more after this period, given that people have had a forced experiment?
So that's a good question. If you were to have asked me a year ago, I would have said everything will go back to normal. And of course, for everyone experiencing a year of this now, I think there will certainly be marginal changes. Probably working from home will be the largest one. More people working at home more frequently. Okay, it doesn't mean that people will not return to offices and such, but there will be at least a marginal change, maybe a little bit more than marginal. And that also implies less commuting, maybe less driving. I don't know what will happen with the walking more or less. That's hard to say. I'm hopeful that, seeing at least in some towns now trying to make these changes permanent for the street closures, hopefully some of that will persist. And then that could have some impacts on increasing walking and such. Hard to say though right now.
Yeah, well, so I agree. Maybe this is one of the threads that I think we could open up in the Facebook page that Professor Rolf Merkel has pasted onto the chat box, and where colleagues actually could discuss, perhaps either during, if you feel very strongly, or perhaps preferably after the workshop. And on the program, there's also reference to colleagues' emails, and if you want to email them directly. And these links Rolf will have already pasted in the chat box. So thank you so much, Bob, and it's a great start of the talk. And I